Shabbat shalom, moadim l'simcha. Ezekiel, the valley of the dry bones. It's a good one, right? It is something that's so good that people have made songs about it. If you didn't realize, left thigh bones connected to the hip bone. That is taken from this whole idea of the valley of dry bones. It has inspired debates and discussions ad nauseum of exactly what the physical restoration of those who have passed will be like in the days past the restoration of Mashiach, of whether or not people will be reconstituted exactly where they were in their graves, whether they will, and yes, this is a literal discussion, roll through underground caverns in order to be resurrected in Israel itself. If you think that's strange, did you ever wonder why the hill, the Mount of Olives, is covered in Jewish graves? It is because they thought they would be able to be resurrected first by being there closest to the Temple Mount. So indeed, the idea of this physicality of the resurrection has inspired much discussion, much debate, much consternation among some others, and still some confusion. Which is a shame because it's entirely wrong. That is to say, yes, Rabbinic Judaism, the conservative movement, believes there will be some form of reconstitution of the deceased in the time to come, but like Rambam, we are not very specific on exactly what this is going to look like, how it will take place, and under what conditions. We figure that God has it worked out, and that's good enough for us. But of course, Ezekiel may have been hinting towards an end of days discussion, but that wasn't his primary focus. That wasn't the main purpose of that prophecy that we just read. Who was the main target? To whom was he addressing his prophecy? To the Babylonians, to the Babylonian Jews. Right. He was talking to the Babylonian community that he was a part of. And why were there so many Jews living in Babylon at that time? The exile. So, destruction of the first temple, 586, more or less, depending upon how you count, 586 BCE. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And a huge portion of the Jewish population was carted off in a mass relocation program, something that was very common in the ancient world, something that we have seen hints of in the modern world in the invasion of Ukraine, with children being carted off to Russia as well. This idea of redistributing populations was very popular among ancient dictators. And so they moved us there, thinking that then we would cause no more trouble. Because, if we weren't on our own soil, then what would we do? We would simply integrate into the general population, and our talents would still be usable by the Babylonian Empire for their economy, but our rebelliousness would be crushed without a land from which to draw strength from. Didn't work out quite like that for the Babylonians, and certainly didn't work out like that for us, because, we're here 2,500 years later. But what was the concern that Ezekiel was trying to address in this prophecy? What was the point of the vision that God gave him that Ezekiel was meant to convey to the population? Remembering that Ezekiel may be the target of the vision, but he's not the target of the prophecy. He is the one who is receiving this insight from Adonai, but the only reason he is receiving it is so that he will turn around and share it with others. What was he trying to tell them? There will be a return. There will be a restoration. Things may look bad now, but it will get better. But that's only the surface. If you'll forgive the expression when talking about a graveyard, we have to dig a little deeper to understand exactly what his bone of contention was. Sorry, it's been a long few days. The problem wasn't just that people thought there will be no restoration. That is the sort of a general statement of their feelings at the time. The problem was why they thought there would be no restoration. And it wasn't for lack of faith in God, at least within this prophecy. In other places, yes, other prophets will take the people to task for lacking faith in God. But here, the people lack faith in themselves and each other. The people consider each other and themselves to be dry bone. That's a metaphor in the biblical idiom of being dry bone, meaning dead and completely lifeless. Freshly slaughtered animals don't have dry bones. Freshly slaughtered animals still have something to give to you from the marrow within them. When you crack open those bones, there's still something pulsing inside of those bones. Dry bones, on the other hand, it's dust. It's nothing. It's gone. And the people looked at one another there in exile in Babylon. They looked at the state of Israel, reduced to ruins under Babylonian destruction and now occupied by foreigners that had been moved in the same way that we had been moved out by the Babylonians. And they basically said, we're done. We are done. God, sure, God is fine. We are done. We are baked, dried, rent of our spirit. There is nothing left that we can give. And that was what Ezekiel wanted to change. He wanted them to look at each other and say, yeah, but you're still here. Yes, I understand the passion that once inflamed you to rise up and revolt against Babylon and led to the destruction. That passion may not be there the way it was. And the joy that you felt when going up for the festivals such as Pesach may not be coming as powerfully as it used to be. But the fact that we still are together in Babylon, that we still look to each other, that we still lament what happened, that shows that we may be bones. But these bones, dry as they may appear, these bones will be able to live again. You still have that spirit within you. And if you recognize that, if you recognize that that skeleton still exists, that framework still exists, no matter how beaten and downtrodden you may feel, once you recognize that, well, then a little sinew will grow, and a little muscle on top of that, and then a little bit more. And eventually you will be fully clothed again in the skin, meaning you will be made whole and complete. But you are not gone as long as there is a you to lament feeling like you are gone. Sort of the opposite of Descartes' axiom of I think, therefore I am. I lament, therefore I am not completely destroyed. And Ezekiel was right. The people needed to hear that they were still there. And Ezekiel needed to hear that they were still there. Imagine what it must have felt like for Ezekiel, the only prophet who was living in Babylon. He looked out and he saw these ragged exiles, these people brought from the homeland into Babylon, wailing, lamenting, and saying, it's over. The game is done. History has run its course for us. We're gone. And yet here he is receiving visions from Adonai. Ezekiel needed to have that faith too. He needed to look out at the skeletons that were coming staggering into Babylon. And he needed to look at them, and he had to know that there was still life in them, that there was still life in the people. He needed to make sure he could not give up. Because sometimes the lament we have is not that I no longer lack passion or I no longer am committed. It's I don't think others have passion equal to mine or are as committed to me. I mean, after all, here we are on the third day of Pesach, and looking around, quite a few people chose to take this Shabbat off. Sure, they had a Seder. Maybe they came to services. Maybe they had a second night Seder. Maybe they came to the second day services. Maybe they came Friday night. And Saturday rolls around 3 days in a row for Chagim. It can be a little exhausting. Do I have the energy to get up again? Those of you who are here, you obviously do. Something drew you in. You knew you had that strength. But tell me, is there a part of your mind that looks around at the empty seats and wonders where those bones are? Where the dry bones of the missing congregants are? And do you feel perhaps a tinge of despair? After all, are there fewer people here than last year when we had Chol HaMoed? Pesach for our Shabbat? I'm not sure. Are we growing? Are we getting weaker? Should I panic? Should I panic more? That's never an option to not panic if you're Jewish. And the message of the Valley of the Dry Bones that Ezekiel is trying to give to us, that God is trying to give to Ezekiel, is they are still here. Well, they may not be in the seats right now alongside you who have a few more sinews and muscles on your bones than they do. But they are still with us. Our congregation is still full of amazing people. They may not always be at every single event, but we can't look at their absence as though they were dead. We look at their absence and say, they need a little more muscle, a little more sinew. How can I help give that to them? How can I help encourage them? How can I help inspire them? And how will that help me reconstitute myself with greater strength, with greater vigor, with greater passion? The Valley of the Dry Bones is about all of us rising up together. And some may have a little more than others of that spirit at different stages, but it is the collective that causes it to eventually be a full restoration. Not about 1, 2, or 3 people drifting back. 1, 2, or 3 inspiring others to join them. Others having then joined, inspiring the original that were there. It becomes a feedback loop. But it only works when we look at that valley and say, there's still life. There is still passion. And if we allow ourselves to grow with that, then there will be more passion and life still. This is the reason for the choice of this Haftorah during Chol HaMoed Pesach, to make sure that we, in exile, much like the Babylonian situation of Ezekiel, although not nearly as dire, obviously, that we too recognize that we are not the ever-dying people, but we are the ever-living people. That we are not drifting into dry bones and desiccation, but that we are constantly renewing and rejuvenating ourselves, allowing ourselves new strength, not to lament, but to celebrate, not to bemoan and bewail, but to give song, to praise, to learn, to love one another. Ezekiel had a powerful vision. Too often we focus only on the end of days message that it might contain. We need to focus on what it was intended to do, to give that power of hope to each and every generation, no matter the situation. Because after all, as he says, with you, God, of course it can happen. Shabbat Shalom.